In this section, I'm going to be looking at trendline trade setups. Now, there's a number of trade setups that trend lines do indeed offer. Even so, I'm only going to focus on two of my most favorite trendline trade setups. And the first trade setup I'm going to be talking about is what I call the gap. And this is what I'm referring to. I'm going to move the slide over. Now, one of the best trade setups I see that trend lines tend to offer is a gap either above or below a trend line. For example, this is a price chart of oats. And I'm just going to draw a simple trend line connecting this low and extend the line upward higher here. Now, as you can see right here, prices gapped lower. This is what I consider a gap below a trend line, and I believe that this tends to be a very high profitable trade setup, or a very reliable trade setup. Now, the way I actually like to trade this move is whenever I see a gap either above or below a trend line, the high or low of the bar that does the gapping, in this instance right here, what I'll do is I'll put a sell order in place one tick below the low of the bar, and my stop will be the high of the bar prior to the gap. So in this instance here, this price gap right here alerted me to a potential short position in oats. And again, the way I would actually trade this trend line trade setup would be on a break below the low of this bar here with a stop at the high of the bar. And as you can see, prices pushed on lower here down to about 240. So this was a nice little trade. Now the next, and let me show you some more examples of this, because it doesn't occur that often, but when it does occur, it tends to be, again, very reliable. So let's just see what we can find with regard to the price action since that trade setup. As you can see, we didn't have a price gap above the trend line here, so there really wasn't an opportunity to take a trade. Now, as you can see, this trend line drawn against this extreme continued on lower here. We did in fact have a price gap at this point here. So again, this is alerting me to a buy-side trading opportunity. And again, the way I like to take advantage of these is the bar that does the gapping, or that gaps up. I like to have an order in one tick above the high of that bar, and then the low of the bar is going to be my initial protective stop. And as you can see, the trade was subsequently triggered and prices pushed on higher here. Now, even if I had not drawn that initial trend line here and say tried to employ what I mentioned in the previous section, utilizing the triple fan, here's my first point here, my second point, my third point, and again we have the gap above the trend line, again signaling a nice buy side or a highly reliable buy side trading opportunity. And again, the way I would trade it would be the high of the bar that does the gapping, one tick above there would be my entry price, and my initial protective stop would be the low prior to the gap, the low of the bar. Now this is just a very quick example of, again, one of my favorite trend line trade setups. Again, there are a number of trade setups trend lines do indeed offer, but with regard to the number that are out there, these are my two favorite, and this is the first one going to be the gap either above or below a trend line, and the second one I'll be talking about shortly will be the retest. Let's take a look at a few more examples. Let's take a look at cotton. Simply connect two extremes, either two extreme lows or two extreme highs. In this instance, I'm just simply connecting this low with this low, and that gives me a nice trend line to work with. And as you can see, prices came down to that trend line and really played around with it for a little while before breaking lower. But as you can see, this bar right here was indeed a gap below the trend line. So I would initiate a sell position on a break of the low of this bar with a stop, initial protective stop, the high of the bar preceding the gap, which would be right here. And as you can see, this led to a very, very nice trade. show you a few more examples. Again, connecting two extremes, two highs, two lows. In this instance, two highs. And as you can see here, prices did indeed gap above the trend line. So that would be my a move above the high of the bar that does the gapping. That's where I put my order into the buy side. And the low of the bar preceding the gap is where my initial protective stop would go. And again, as you can see, this did indeed lead to a very nice profitable trade to the upside. And again over here, I'm just simply connecting two extremes, two lows, right here and right here. And as you can see, there was a gap below the trend line. Again, these are very reliable trend line trade setups. They don't occur that often, but when they do, again, they're very reliable. And this is how I like to trade them. In this instance, we have a short trade setup. Once prices trade below the low of the bar that does the gap, either the gap up or the gap down, that's my entry. And then the high of the bar preceding the gap, the high of this bar, is my initial protective stop. So that's another example of my gapping technique with regard to trend lines. And let me just show you one more market. Again, just a simple trend line drawn against the highs, the price highs of the move. This high against this high, also this high here. As you can see, there's a small little price gap right here. So the way I would have handled this would have been to put in an entry to the buy side, one tick above the extreme of the bar that did the gap, and then my initial protective stop would be the low of the bar preceding the gap. So this is my trend line trade setup, or my gap technique with regard to trend lines, and this is a very reliable setup. It doesn't occur that often, but when it does indeed introduce some sizable moves in price that from a trading perspective I think are indeed worthwhile.